abominable as it is unsurprising. In a contentious February 16th meeting of the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control, the CDC effectually confirmed they would not admit any fault for their role in the opioid crisis, nor revise their devastating 2016 opioid guidelines. Without the CDC's endorsement to remedy their blunders, Congress and public health will push for ever stricter and more punitive medical access for anyone that is ever needing pain relief, undoubtedly creating further tragic overdose deaths. That science proves this is a terrible idea does not seem to matter all that much to the members of the CDC. Public health is about to make matters considerably worse for pain patient and addict alike.
The Happy Warrior Podcast. Conservative commentary on the news of the day from a more positive perspective.
Hello and welcome, all my friends. My name is Peter Pischke, and this is a very special episode of the Happy Warrior Podcast. And if you happen to live in the New York metro area, please go down to your local newsstand and pick up the Sunday edition of the New York Daily News, because inside of that you will find a special surprise from moi. In today's episode, we will be going through my breakout article with the New York Daily News, A Painful Struggle, Opioids Can Be Dangerous, but Restrictions or a Ban Are Worse. In today's episode, we are going to go through this article, and I'm going to break into each of the features and parts of it, talk about the studies, talk about the science, talk about what the news is and what it means. But before we do all that, I just want to say a huge shout out and I have enormous gratitude to the New York Daily News and its editor, Karen Lowe, who helped make this project possible. Her support, helping this project to come to fruition. I mean, I cannot say and express enough gratitude to her and to all those who support me. My family, of course, my friends, you, my audience. I have been blessed to know so many just incredible people, and I am grateful to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for believing in me and supporting me so that I could create some of what at least I consider is some terrific journalism. And of course, if you like what you hear here today or in the article, please post it on all your socials. Tell your family, tell your friends, spread it around. You can find us on Twitter at Happy Warrior P, and Facebook and Minds we are at Happy Warrior Pete. Alrighty, friends, now let's jump into the meat of this subject. The name of the New York Daily News article is A Painful Struggle, Opioids Can Be Dangerous, but Restrictions or a Ban Are Worse. This project really came about from the efforts of me and other reporters to watch the CDC. The CDC promised us in 2019 that they would fix their awful 2016 CDC guidelines that effected an American prohibition against pain treatment, in particular opioids. In that important December 2019 meeting, the CDC members promised us they were going to make sure there would be a revision of the guidelines by some point in 2021. A work group was put together, and on the work group were members that had been there previously with the CDC, but also doctors, pain patient advocates, addiction experts, human rights lawyers. It was a solid mix, and people had a lot of hope in what was being done. And as we followed this, coronavirus hit, and everything, got crazy. And it was really hard to pay attention to one issue, let alone the flood of issues that came about over the last year. Well, when the CDC met again in 2021, what happened was shocking. And Many of the advocates I talk to, people who are experts in pain and addiction, people who have family members that have severe disabling pain issues, they were just flabbergasted and they lost all hope. It is for these people and their loved ones that inspire me to write this project. And that the New York Daily News was willing to take me on and work so hard with me on it and to get all our facts straight, to use the best language, is amazing. And I cannot express my gratitude enough. This is a very important story, and it was only through their goodwill and hard efforts that we're able to get it to you today. So let's go through some of the basics. As many of my normal listeners are aware, the opioid crisis is more complex than many people realize. But for people who are new here, we will go through the numbers. So what is the opioid crisis you're hearing all about? You probably think it's something about doctors prescribing too many pain meds and people becoming addicts, right? You know, they go to their dentist, they get a wisdom tooth removed, they're given some oxy, and then they're an addict for life. There are 5 major feature films and documentaries right now going on that all believe and push this narrative. This is the central mainstream opioid crisis narrative. Okay, but reality, particularly on this issue, is much more complicated. So let's set our terms. The opioid crisis, the opioid overdose crisis, is a growing colossal illicit fentanyl overdose crisis. Fentanyl is a very powerful opioid and is used primarily in palliative care, cancer treatment, end-of-life treatment, and for surgeries. Okay, for most pain patients, fentanyl is not a treatment they receive. Now, this illicit, as in it's not coming from your hospitals or your pharmacy, it's coming from Chinese shipping containers, and it's coming through illegal drug trafficking over the southern border, and of course the dark web. People are getting this illicit fentanyl in their systems, and it is killing at least 80,000 Americans in 2020 alone. To really understand the opioid overdose crisis, you need to understand how all of this started. How did America go from some people were illegally using opioids, and how did that turn into people illegally using opioids and then dropping dead? What happened there? Well, we have the answer on that, and it is the Obama Fda. You see, in 2009, the FDA had this fantastic big head idea, okay? Their idea was this. OxyContin, which had been sold since the mid-90s and is a product of Purdue. Yes, the Purdue, that one that is associated with the Sackler family and that has seen so many lawsuits over the last 2 years. OxyContin is a fairly effective pain medication. It's also a pretty popular one. And it has this interesting property to it. You see, heroin users who couldn't actually afford the full thing, they found that if you took oxy and you smashed it, you crushed it into a powder, and you mixed water, it became like a gel-like material. And it kind of worked like heroin. This was heroin on the cheap, poor man's heroin. Someone calls this, I've heard, Appalachian heroin. Okay, so people were doing this, and that's not healthy for them. The FDA said, okay, so if we make Purdue, make it so you can't turn OxyContin into cheap heroin, then that in theory would mean all these people who are using it wouldn't, and then we would fight addiction, get people to stop taking opioids. It'd be just lovely, just wonderful. This turned out to be an enormous mistake. This may be, until COVID and the screw-ups there, this may be one of the great screw-ups in all of American medical history. Just an incredible screw-up of such an epic American proportion. How was this a mistake? Why was this a mistake? Well, because these users can no longer access their cheap heroin. And I use cheap relatively. Oxy is sometimes $200 on the black market. People needed something else. Okay, these people, they're like, okay, we can't get our oxy hit. We're just going to go with something else. And what they went to are things like black tar heroin. And at some point, some creative and clever drug seller on the black market figured out if they use fentanyl if they use fentanyl, which is cheap, it is cheap as dirt to create, okay? Primarily actually started with carfentanil, which is the fentanyl they use to treat animals, particularly large animals like a horse. And they're like, okay, this stuff is cheap. We'll use this. People, they'll get the high. And what they found out was actually many users preferred this because it is a very powerful drug. In not too much time, it became centralized in the pipeline, which means fentanyl would be made in places like China, it would be made in South America, and it would be put in shipping containers that come in that way, or it would be pushed through the southern border through illegal drug trafficking, and it became the central and main drug used in the black market, and not just for heroin. It became, many people have stories of a loved one passing away, not because they used heroin, but because they used black market ADHD medication. So fentanyl became the main filler for the black market. And that meant that people started to drop dead. People who had only touched drugs one time in their life, people who were just curious, people who were students. A local reporter in my area, she became an activist on this issue because her kid just took an ADHD medication and had fentanyl in it, and that was it. Eric Bowling, he has a very similar story about his son. These are people who didn't necessarily have a large drug addiction problem, but that you just needed it the one time and you overdose, and that was it. So under these terms, the overdose crisis has been going on since 2011. Really, the deaths started to rise in 2012, which was when the media started to really pay attention, because many of the people that were dying from this were the children of the affluent. Okay, previously, drug deaths were a lower class problem. They were a minority problem often, especially back in the 80s and the crack cocaine epidemic. What changed in the 2010s was people of influence, their kids started to be getting hurt and suffering from these overdoses. At the same time, big litigation was looking for a new cash cow. Asbestos had basically dried up. Tobacco isn't what it used to be, and they needed something new. And so there was this epic mix of media interest, lawyers, their interests, and the well-to-do and their kids' interests all dying. At the same time, you add in places like industrial Ohio and Appalachia and the dysfunction there that is highly tied to illegal opioid use. And you had the cocktail for an epic media narrative. And that is how we got the attention that makes up the opioid crisis. Now, every death, every overdose, every suffering, every addict is a tragedy. Do not ever mistake me for not taking that suffering seriously. But I am a journalist. I tell the truth, and it is unpopular, but it is a hard reality that the opioid crisis, the overdose crisis, isn't really heavily tied to prescription opioids. You know, those medicines that you get in the orange bottles. And that's hard for a lot of people to hear. But we have to base what we know of reality on facts, figures, statistics, science, whenever you can get it, before we go in and just word of mouth, your stories on social media. Qualitative data has some use, but quantitative data is supreme. The hard truth is prescription opioids only ever played a minor role in the crisis. An important one. A lot of this probably wouldn't have happened without it, but a minor one. How do we know this? Well, we know this through data, studies, and statistics. Medical code surveys at hospitals, when they determine your care and diagnostic, they have to go through medical codes. Well, medical code surveys, they look at how people are actually diagnosed, finds that prescription opioids are rarely a part of the problem. Same with autopsy reviews. When autopsies are done of people who have overdosed, they find that prescription opioids rarely are solely responsible for killing someone. And when they are present, it almost is always a small part of a very large cocktail of many substances, each on their own enough to kill the person off. We also know this through statistical analyses. And we can do comparative studies from here and other countries. We can look from between states and states. And we find, overwhelmingly, the data shows that prescription opioids are only solely responsible for about 1% of the deaths, and that often is a high figure. The figures often range from 0.0023% to 3%. And those two are kind of a misnomer. Okay, 1% is almost around there is always what we find. It is a very small amount. Those who suffer, who died from that 1%, are tragedies. But we have to keep things accurate. Okay? Is that fair? Now, there are issues with prescription opioids. It is fair to say that American medicine swung too far in the 1990s towards pain treatment. You need to understand in the 1990s, there was this thing called the fifth vital sign, and it was instigated from the Veterans Administration, the people who run the VA hospital. And it was based on the issue of opioid phobia. Doctors, physicians, and scientists noticed, primarily in the 80s, that America from about the 1920s to the 1990s was under what was known as opioid phobia. You can see this not just in America, but in foreign films as well. I recently watched Daibyonin, which is a Japanese film by Juzo Itami, which is about the story of someone that became sick and had to stay in the hospital. And part of the drama in that movie is that they are scared to give him pain medication because they're afraid he might become addicted. This fear was everywhere, and it came largely from the prohibition pushed by Woodrow Wilson and then other progressives when they pushed other big think ideas of their time, like FDR, and then it was reinforced again with Nixon in the 70s. And this was referred to as, in the scientific literature, as opioid phobia. It was everywhere. And so, in reaction to that, to help patients get pain treatment, that was a very necessary step. The VA, the FDA, the CDC, public health in general, in the United States and across the world, stepped too far. They made a radical overswing against the opioid phobia that dominated most of the 20th century. And, here's a little bit of the tragedy is we really could have, at that time in the 1990s, used prudence. Okay, prudence, wisdom, moderation. Pain and addiction patients, because the narrative as it is, are always put against each other in the articles. These documentaries, these movies like Crisis, you can see it. It's like addiction on one side, patient on another. Fight to the death. It really isn't that case. It really is. Actually, pain patient and addiction patient, people in the addiction community, their interests are actually very much aligned most of the time. And so if only these two groups had been treated that way, that we believed that we could show compassion to both, that everyone had their needs met, and we weren't limited by trying to stop one community over the other. Okay, their needs are not oppositional. Nevertheless, we live in a very puritanical culture. We do one big thing at a time. We have a hard time with moderation, with small steps. And as leaders of the world, we drag much of them with us when we do this. Although similar ideas were in other places of the world, similar concerns that I talked about with Japan. So it wasn't just the United States, but the United States was the biggest. Okay, so we'll go back. So in the 2010s, people are dying from the opioid crisis. There are all these books, there are all these movies and TV shows, J.D. Vance, and they say, we got to do something about this. So in 2016, the CDC, under Frederick, they decided that they needed to do something big. And so they hired members belonging to big rehab. And that is a topic for another day, but it is a thing. American rehab is crazy messed up with corruption and bad incentives. You can, if you want to learn more about that, go to my friends at the Narcotica podcast, like Zach Siegel, Troy Farah. I know Maya Salvitz is another one that's written a lot on this topic. If you want to know the problems of big rehab, go talk to them. Go read them. So the CDC hired, and this was totally unprecedented, because the CDC had never had an opinion any which way about prescription opioids, because they're the CDC. They're about diseases, preventing pandemics. They are not about basic, physician protocol. That just wasn't their job. That's why we have the FDA and the NIH. But they decided this was now their job, and they hired people belonging to Physicians for Responsible Opioid Prescribing, which in my opinion are a corrupt blight on addiction medicine, and they should be ashamed of themselves. This guideline that came out was technically only ever supposed to be guidance. It didn't have force of law. The guideline said that there was a limit for pain medication for the MME, morphine equivalents. So it's 90 milligrams of morphine equivalents. This, unfortunately, did not get interpreted as just a guideline. Only 3 days after the release of the guideline, Obama's Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, who is now Biden's Surgeon General, put out a letter to 2.3 million physicians warning them to not prescribe physicians more than 3 days and to be very careful about chronic care. So it wasn't just the Surgeon General. Throughout the federal administration, throughout the states, the state legislatures, the law enforcement groups, both local, national, and state, they all interpreted this as a clarion call that it's cool now to go after prescription opioids to fight the crisis. Or as you've often heard on TV, we're going to arrest our way out of this crisis. The 2016 CDC guideline thus became an even more radical counterswing to the fifth vital sign. And law enforcement agencies like the DEA, state legislatures like my own in South Dakota, took this as a hard rule. This was the call for the crusade against prescription opioids. As you can guess, this really hurt pain patients, and we will go into that in a little bit. But it didn't just hurt pain patients because it misfocused where our efforts should be to help those who are dealing with addiction. And so subsequently, because of the guideline, the deaths for not only addicts, but pain patients greatly accelerated. Now, I am talking to you from 2021. 5 years have elapsed since the guidelines were released, and what are their results? Well, the opioid crisis is graver than ever. We saw a huge uptick in deaths during the corona pandemic, but there were signs it was already headed that direction beforehand. Today, millions, and I mean millions, perhaps tens of millions of patients are without access to hardly any pain treatment whatsoever. In particular, these populations are very much impacted. Children, the disabled, veterans, African Americans in particular are really hard hit by prohibition, and cancer patients. Any one of those groups, any member of your family or friend being denied pain medication when they need it is horrific. But altogether, these people being denied medical treatment, denied access to the medical treatment they need, that's reprehensible. And what for their sacrifice? For the sacrifice of these millions, what have we received? Well, stats now show the number of people abusing illegal drugs is virtually unchanged. You would think maybe with so many people dropping dead, there'd be less people abusing drugs. Not so. Addiction, it's a complex thing. Now, for a very long time, when advocates and reporters tried to get the attention of the medical institutions, the media, it went nowhere. But in 2019, there started to be made progress. And the real leader that was pushing this, the one that actually had emphasis, was the American Medical Association, which I've criticized a lot as of late, as you can tell in the last podcast. But I'll give them credit. Noticing the suffering of millions of innocent patients harmed by these exceptionally unhelpful and misfocused restrictions, the American Medical Association announced publicly their opposition against the guidelines. And to a lot of tension and a lot of attack, they stood strong still. There were some minor calls for revisions, minor letters, and official word was put out from the CDC and the FDA and others, but no one really took them seriously. They were trying to say, well, yeah, don't overprescribe, but also don't underprescribe. And it just kind of went through one ear and out the other throughout America, and as far as I could tell elsewhere. So people are like, yeah. You know, you're like, we're not really sure if you mean this. So, under tremendous pressure from the AMA, they got the CDC to admit in December of 2019 in a what we hoped was going to be a historical meeting that they were going to revise the 2016 CDC guideline. They were going to edit them, or they were going to revise them, or they were going to provide some kind of big Correction. I was present on that meeting. I watched it digitally. I had my phone on. And some of the stuff they expressed there was truly heartening. For example, Dr. Roger Cho, he was the primary author of the guidelines. He is not a member of PROP, but he has often been associated with them and their goals. Even he had said that he had received letters from law enforcement and his hospital system telling him that he was overprescribing his patients. And in these letters, they would cite his name and work. During the comment period, when people were sharing what the damage the guidelines did and how the CDC needed to fix this, many tears were shed, and Dr. Chow, I think it's Chow, sorry if I say your name wrong, doctor, was with them. Okay, they were members of the CDC there. They were crying. I mean, maybe they weren't going to say it totally, but there was a recognition that a great harm had been done, and they were taking responsibility, and they were going to fix it. And I will tell you personally, after that meeting, I talked with a lot of pain patients that had been abandoned. I talked with some advocates. And I heard from multiple people this general sentiment. I'm having a really difficult time. I don't know if I can keep going. But the CDC says they're going to fix this. So if I could just hold out to 2021 and them fixing the guidelines, that'll be enough. Then I'll be able to get taken care of and all will be well. Well, history intervened, and in 2020, the COVID pandemic landed. At some point in 2020, something changed at the CDC, majorly. The internal politics at the CDC shifted dramatically, unbeknownst to even members of the CDC opioid work group that were going to fix the guideline. Their regulatory authority, in a sense, had been shunted away from them. Instead, that authority went to the parent organization, the National Center for Injury Prevention and Control. The NCIPC is a hopelessly and infamously political arm of the CDC. They busy themselves with the contagious diseases of gun violence and traffic accidents. They're the ones that's leading the way on researching equity and solving teen suicide. Now, many of those issues are important, but if the NCIPC is the one in charge, people generally know not to expect much progress on it. Or as one scientist jokingly told me, the NCIPC is where solutions go to die. So here is where we get to the news relevant part of this story. So last month, on February 16th, the NCIPC made it clear, in that classic bureaucratic way of saying everything by nothing, that there had been a major change of plans. Previously, the CDC had said that they were going to be taking some responsibility for what was going on with the opioid crisis. In particular, the CDC was going to take responsibility and try to fix the informal opioid prohibition they had created, hurting patients immensely. Fast forward 2 years to this February 16th meeting, and they made it clear by their issue of priorities, by their refusal to admit fault or to talk about the issue, everything had changed. I mean everything. To give you an idea of how little the NCIPC really cares about the overdose crisis or the opioid prohibition. I mean, they don't care about neither of them. A total of 10 minutes was centered on the work group. And you know what we found out? The work group had met twice since then. And they had not even chosen the style of language that they were going to use for their drafting documents. Okay, they got nothing done. They had nothing. And it is by law that if they were going to submit something, they had to put it out by March of this year because it has to go through the public comment system. It's because the public has to be allowed to comment. It has to work its way through the regulatory affairs. So this was saying that there was not going to be a revision in 2021. But more than that, I think the CDC has made it clear that there's not likely to be any admission of fault for the crisis or the prohibition. Okay, they spent a total of 10 minutes in this meeting, 10 minutes on this work group. But at the same time, they spent in this meeting 30 minutes congratulating one another for their handling, their oh so courageous handling of the crisis. It was, to be frankly honest, it was bloody disgusting. It really was. It was totally shocking. And everyone I talked to that was connected to it or knew someone that was with the work group were shocked beyond words. There was a lot of despondency. There was a lot of anger and frustration. I mean, just in complete shock. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. As a final insult, the panel decided to snub federal law and public comments. Now, here's the law. It is the law that if the CDC, the FDA, the VA, any of them put out a major regulatory revision, they have to go to the public and get their comment, and then they have to incorporate it somehow. Now, this isn't always done in good faith. Sometimes it's just ridiculous. Like, they never actually use this information, but that's the law. Now, the CDC remembered in 2019 when they had people saying, you killed my grandma. You killed me. Okay? That stuff. And the opioid work group, the proto-opioid work group, okay, they're willing to hear it. NCIPC, with that work on these issues, they have no time for it. They are not going to sit there and have people attack them, hear how people are suffering because of their actions. No, man, no good. They don't want that. So what do? They play this game on Zoom, and I will play the audio in a second, where they make it appear as if no one of the public had showed up for public comment. Ergo, they couldn't give public comment. They would say, if you're here, click the mute button on Zoom, except that control was on their side. And by playing this game, they made it impossible for everyone in this 30 minutes, but 4 people, all of them with some relation to medicine. Okay, they were either people who worked in medicine or they had the doctor title, and you couldn't tell if they were of that or not. Only they were allowed to give testimony during the comment period. After the 30 minutes elapsed, all the important people leave the room, and it's just the chairman and 2 others. And she says, oh, we have to allow people to comment, so we're going to allow some people now to comment. Now, all the important people are gone. Everyone that has influence at the CDC has left. Now people are allowed to talk. You see how the game is played? I am now going to play a part of that comment period. A person I know recorded it. Now, I have anonymized their voice. You do not know who this is. I will not tell you. But this will just give you a little taste of what happened there, and we will have to wait till, and I doubt they'll ever release it, the CDC releases the actual video for the meeting.
Let's see, who are we going to try next?
Not hearing from Daniel.
Why doesn't it occur to him that their system isn't working?
Helen Cisneros. Helen, if you are available for public comment at this time, please feel free to unmute your line.
We don't have an unmute button. See?
Not hearing from Helen. Let me move on to Umar, and apologies in advance. Tijani, at this time, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Is this intentional?
Not hearing from Umar. I will move on to William Aiken, apologies. William, if you are available for public comment at this time, please feel free to unmute yourself. Not hearing from William, I will move on to Shelley. Apologies.
This is just abominable. We've been doing this for 15 minutes now. There is no unmute button.
Beth Larson Steckler.
Come on, Beth, get on.
Beth, if you are available
for public comment, please feel free to unmute your line at this time.
So we're 15 minutes into this now.
Hearing from Beth, I will move on to Gloria Ulrich. Gloria, if you are available for public comment at this time, please feel free to unmute yourself. Not hearing from Gloria, I will move on to Mary, and apologies again in advance, Veriniatis, IOTIS. If you are available for public comment at this time.
Look at this. This has been going on for 20 minutes now.
Not hearing from Dina, I will move on.
20 minutes in now?
Collins. Kimberly, if you are available for public comment, please feel free to. Not hearing from Kimberly, I will move on.
Now, that audio I shared with you should be pretty shocking when you consider in context what it is. Now, the chairperson is Dr. Victoria Frey, and I don't know how exactly all this happened. There's enough wiggle room here. I guarantee the CDC is going to deny that they played this game. But I am not going to lie to you. They did. They played a game because they didn't want to have to take the heat that they rightly deserve. And that's what happened. And it's grotesque. It really is. It is moral, reprehensibly, scientifically dishonest. It's not a good faith attempt to get to the public and to hear what they want to say because they don't care what the public thinks. This is the NCIPC, okay? They are just a very political group. They're not one known for being very serious scientists, as the opioid work group was. So after this meeting, I decided to call some of my sources, my contacts. I talked to about 6 or 7 people. I'm like, okay, so what do you think of this? Some of these people are very connected to the opioid work group or the CDC or some big institution. Some of these are advocates. Some of these are pain experts. Some of these are addiction experts. Some people are a mix and they have a disabled child. One woman in particular, she expressed to me how disappointed she was, and she had zero hope that anything would get better. And her family member, her son, is in a terrible amount of pain and is sometimes suicidal. And they don't know how to keep him going, how to convince him life is worth keeping together. And this kind of news, I'm sorry, I try not to get too emotional, forgive me. It's something I'm working on. Was like taking a sledgehammer to that guy, to that young man. And it's reprehensible because the members of the CDC, they should know, if they do not already, that their words have weight to them, much more than mine ever will. That they needed to take these things seriously and not act like juvenile teenagers on TikTok. So people who watched this meeting were just shocked and mortified. And 3 of the work group members, I can confirm, told me either through directly or through friends, they were like, we had no idea what was going on. We weren't even hardly notified there was going to be a meeting. Some of them said they had been notified at all. They were shocked at the change. Some of them kind of half admitted that, the project is dead in the water. Many advocates after this, they get together petitions. They tried to go to every comment period they could to say their frustrations. Dozens of widely respected collision scholars sent formal complaints to the CDC. People were really, and forgive my language, pissed off. And you consider everything that's happened. And it's understandably so, right? If you were treated like that by your car repairman, wouldn't that make you very angry? Let alone these people who are going to have so much control over the fate of so many millions of human lives. It's just such a shocking piece of audio. It is truly shocking. Wow. So what does this mean for the future? What does this mean for patients? What does this mean for people who are in the addiction community, in the disability community, African Americans and veterans, cancer patients, and patients who are at the end of their lives or their children? What does this mean for them? It likely doesn't mean anything positive. This change in priorities by the CDC, because we were relying on the CDC to fix this, to say, we screwed up, you guys weren't supposed to take the guidelines as a law, this wasn't supposed to be a holy crusade against orange bottles. The only way that things were going to get better, the CDC really dug deep and got loud. and tried to fix this in a really serious effort. It had to be big. It couldn't be just milquetoast like they had been trying somewhat at the FDA and NIH. And so what this means is that the CDC has essentially endorsed, in public health, a formalization of opioid prohibition. They're endorsing an ever-tightening, ever stricter net of restrictions, while an overdose crisis rages unabated, and I guarantee you will get worse. The word is out in public health, and it's out 1,000 different ways, many of them whispers, some of them as loud as a bus. There is a new gospel in town, and it is total opioid prohibition. Okay, you ready? I have talked to medical students, and they have informed me, and I've heard this from people who teach medical school, that the word they tell students when they're looking at what specialty they should go to, they are warned to stay far away from the now radioactive profession of pain medicine. In particular, addiction and chronic pain management. They said, don't go near it with a 100-foot pole. It is a great way to get your license removed, to ruin your career, to always be butting heads with law enforcement, to never get anywhere. You know, you get heck from all the patients that you work with, and you're getting heck from all your hospital system and the law enforcement, and it's just not worth it. I've heard that many times now. Here's another example. I talked about him earlier. President Biden's new Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy. He is an anti-opioids partisan. He's a true believer, sir. Under Biden's leadership, Health and Human Services is right now attempting to substantially undermine medical privacy from HIPAA. That honestly, if these regulations are made official, would just make HIPAA superfluous. I mean, there would be no point to this thing. It so widely undermines HIPAA restrictions, HIPAA protections, really, so that your community can help solve your addiction problem. It gets rid of those walls that stop cooperation, which we used to call privacy laws. While this is happening, as you have read me report before in the Post-Millennium and elsewhere, the DEA is currently, Filter Magazine's the first one that reported this, by the way, shout out to them. The DEA is creating a universal prescription monitoring program that will completely circumvent HIPAA. Now, technically, HIPAA didn't apply to law enforcement, but we weren't worried about law enforcement getting in everyone's business, except now they are. And it's not just public health, law enforcement, American agencies and institutions that are pushing prohibition. It's also international, in particular the United Nations, with groups like the World Health Organization, disturbingly announced an official guideline that children with cancer be restricted access to pain therapies unless they were certainly and terminally ill. That last two is in quotes. I know. I had a sister that was a childhood cancer patient, and that was horrible. That was a horrible, traumatic experience. The idea that you would deny a little child pain medicine, there are a few things more evil than that in my mind. But this is what's being said now. You don't want to get your toddler addicted, so you can't let them have any pain medicine. That's what the narrative says. This is what public health thinks. They think that's what the public wants. I mean, the media says all the time. So there you go. There it is. Congress, being that sycophantic organization that really can't think for itself, they're in on this. There are at least 5 major bills right now. There is a fantastic article in Forbes. People with chronic pain are claiming a voice in the opioids crisis. It came out about a week ago. It was written by Andrew Polrong, and he is a disabled reporter like myself. It looks, as far as I can tell, his disability seems to be a much harsher one than my own. Here is just one example of these bills that are sitting in Congress. The CARA Act 2.0 is a bipartisan bill awaiting in committee that, if made law, would make attaining opioids for even acute care patients extremely difficult. It limits prescriptions to no more than 3 days for everybody, as is recommended by the CDC. So it is not an exaggeration to say, with the combination of draconian state laws, chilling PDMPs, prescription drug monitoring programs, NARC scores. I mean, NARC scores are just, they're one whole issue that's hard enough by itself. But in combination with the rest, you throw in a 3-day limit, and you're cementing a full-blown total opioid prohibition that will not only hurt patients, but it will generate an ever-rising flood of human misery. And this problem of the total opioid prohibition, it isn't just domestic, as I talked a little bit about earlier. For example, let's go to our friends in the United Kingdom. I've recently done some writing for an outlet over there. If you are a patient in the UK, you have 3 levels minimum to get through if you want pain access. In the United Kingdom, for example, there is the National Institute for Healthcare and Excellence guideline, and it is an extremely restrictive guideline. It's quite something, where they just come out and say it. It forbids treatment for chronic pain, period. There's also the European Pain Federation guidelines. Those ban pain treatment for everyone except for secondary pain syndromes. And of course, the World Health Organization, as we said, it disturbingly announced children with cancer will be restricted access to pain medication unless they're terminally ill. So if you're a UK patient, you have many regulations that you have to cut through to be able to get access to pain medicine. And it isn't just true in the UK, it's true in Canada. It's true now in Australia. It's true in Ireland. It's true in much of the Western industrial world. There's some evidence to suggest that in Asia, places like China are starting to look into similar ideas. So this idea, while it popped up other places a little bit organically, it got a huge shove by the United States and the CDC. And it is just a behemoth all around the world. So that bit that said your loved ones are unlikely to be spared, this is based on data and experience. So there's so much data right now that shows this, but I'll just give you a few of them. A recent study found that over half of all clinics now outright refuse to take on pain patients. Another study, at a tune of 80%, said that pain doctors were hesitant to bring on new patients. A CDC survey found 85% of patients said the guidelines made their pain and quality of life worse. In a similar study, almost half admitted to having developed suicidal thoughts. And here's the kicker. The DEA's own friggin' statistics. My friend Pat Anson noticed this in their official March document talking about the DEA and where it's going. The DEA now admits that diversion, that idea that legitimate medicine was being moved from places like your pharmacy or industrial supplier, and that was how the medicine was getting on the black market. Well, the evidence for that was never super strong. It was true in regional aspects. Industrial Appalachia, industrial Ohio, some in California. You know, there were places, especially with lots of blue-collar or former blue-collar workers, there seemed to be some cases of that. But the evidence wasn't ever super strong for the diversion case. And according to the DEA, the DEA now says that diversion is at a 9-year low. And here's another statistic that was in their document, and I don't know how some of these people sleep at night. They found that a staggering 64% of those who are misusing opioids currently, so people who are abusing opioid drugs, licit and illicit. Here's the reason why they said they did it. Quote, identified relieving pain as the main purpose, unquote. That is a shocking figure. That says that a lot of people that are now abusing drugs on the black market came there because they were formerly pain patients, or they were patients of some kind. That we have fed the addiction, that the whole point of this whole project in the friggin' first place was to stop addiction, and it has done the exact opposite. The DEA admits that, at least to itself. There is a racial angle to this. And some people were, I talked about the AMA story in the last one about structural racism. I told you when we talk about racism, we can't treat it like the force, like it's in everything and it binds everything and it puts us all together. We have to use specifics, okay? Same for ableism, same for all of them. Because if we really want to fight these things, we have to fight them where they exist. You can't do generalized, because if you say it's generalized, people, they won't really look where the problem is. I mean, there are many reasons why you don't. For one, accuracy and honesty is always important. Well, there is a strong case of historical racism in pain treatment for African Americans. There is a fantastic historical article I've included in here about how African Americans, even during the Civil War, when their soldiers were fighting for the Union, that they were denied pain medication when their white compatriots were allowed it. And if you look at the statistics, there's a lot to say that dearth of pain medicine has stayed around in some form. The New York Times and Andrew Kalani of Prop shamelessly wrote an article that argued that black patients not receiving pain medication was a good thing. It was a silver lining of racism. Can't you see, guys? Sometimes racism is good. As the media has never said about anything else, ever. At least not in my lifetime. But here they were. This is awesome, guys. Look at this. I laugh, but it's insane. So what can you do but laugh? Now, the sickle cell patients being denied pain medicine, they won't think it's funny. They won't think it's funny at all. New York Times does. This tragedy doesn't stop with patients, as I've said. Recent statistical analyses from the CDC itself shows proof perfect that destabilizing patients is getting more people killed. Okay, this isn't just an idea or a guess. We pretty much know it now. From 2013 to 2019, this statistic will floor you. It is, I heard it, and it stayed with me. It doesn't go away. From 2013 to 2019, deaths attributable to illegal drugs mushroomed exponentially, with illicit fentanyl deaths in the United States growing 11-fold to a colossal 1,040% increase. 6 years. 1,040% increase in fentanyl deaths. The whole point of this project was to stop said deaths. And we now know it only made things much worse. It was like pouring gasoline on an overdose crisis fire. And you learn that statistic. You learn what's happening to African American patients. You hear what the CDC is doing, and it does dim your look at the world and the good of people, the good of society and our institutions. There is a real sickness in America, and I wrote about this and talked about it with you guys back in December when I talked about the Hillbilly Elegy movie. There's a apathy in our soul. There's a dysfunction. There's we stopped caring about each other kind of feeling. Like we have this general attitude, but when it actually comes to specific people, we treat them like crap. I mean, we can all see this on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. I mean, Zuckerberg wants to let kids younger than 13 get on Instagram so they can enjoy it too. Okay, there is a sickness in us, of kindness, a coldness, a lack of care. And it in particular affects the plight of addicts and pain patients alike, as we sadly learned over the last presidential cycle. Neither sides, neither political tribe cares. They don't really care. I mean, they care about issues for sure, but neither pro-lifers nor the left obsessed with equity are interested in halting the silent carnage. They don't care. I implore you, my friends, to anyone listening that has not recognized what a tremendous and colossal wrong this whole thing is, this whole project's top to bottom, start to finish, and pray one day it does. Here is a clip of audio from a news report I had on my YouTube channel to give you an idea of what is happening every day in America.
Michelle Wilson says her son Gary Presley had his life all planned out. In 2011, Presley came back to the U.S., being medically discharged in 2012 after a bad car accident. Wilson says that's when another war started at the Dublin VA.
It was just a battle with the medications, the doctors, and I watched him cry because he couldn't get the help he needed.
Struggling to receive care for pain and mental health care.
He started talking about, Mom, I don't have the fight in me anymore.
Just days later, the family learned last week Presley was going to end his life.
He told his girlfriend that he was going to do it in the parking lot so they could find his body so that maybe somebody would pay attention to what's happening. So other vets don't have to go through this.
America, please open your eyes. The damage inflicted on good and innocent and law-abiding Americans is profound. America, please open your eyes. The damage inflicted on innocent and law-abiding American patients is, quite truthfully, profound. And the hard truth, the uncomfortable truth, the reality of the matter is that however noble the CDC's intentions started, however well-meaning they were and are, we now have the price for the bill due. And that cost is a gentle massacre as unheard anguish echoes inside gloomy rooms across the United States and the world. Let there be no doubt, those deaths and those lives ruined are squarely on the heads of the CDC. Their apathy, their dogma, and their stubborn refusal to do the right thing, to take responsibility, is as unsurprising as it is revolting. Human lives be damned. Well, I implore all of you, please go, if you live in New York, go buy a copy of the New York Daily News. Go to your newsstand. You will find my name in the opinion section. That's where we could get this. It's a 2-page spread. I mean, this is pretty dang good. And the New York Daily News took on a big risk here because everyone else that's tried to talk about this issue has gotten slammed pretty bad by the media. Famously, Tucker Carlson, who I generally like, but he decided to say that Dr. Sally Satel is a shill at the American Enterprise Institute, fully well knowing how these things work. He knows these things are funny. It's not the slam dunk he said it was, but exactly. It's just you come out under a lot of fire to talk about this issue. It's unpopular. It's not quite its time. But the problem with that is, as time goes on and it doesn't get talked about and there is no fix by the CDC, more and more people suffer and more people die, patients and addicts alike. So there is a cost for apathy. There's always a cost for apathy. We just don't see it until it becomes history. And then everyone says, well, if I was there, I would have done the right thing. I would have been part of the French Resistance. Of course. People are friggin' ridiculous. So please share the podcast, share the article, put on all your socials, subscribe to the podcast if you haven't. I know I've been gone for a while. I came back. It's been crazy with my family from COVID. It's just been really hard, some of the things that came from that. So I am back here now. The podcast is back to normal. We do an episode a week, different subject each time. We have guests. We do jokes. It's fun. It's a fun show. And I appreciate the support you give me all the time. You can follow me on Twitter at HappyWarriorP. I am Peter Pischke, your friendly neighborhood journo. And you can find me also on Facebook and Minds at Happy Warrior Pete. My profile is now verified. That's kind of cool. And, LinkedIn, other places. You can find me here, there, and everywhere. And, of course, at the Post Millennial and now the New York Daily News. Thank you so much for your support. Your prayers and kindness and hard work are greatly appreciated. And, I do believe in the ultimate goodwill and good intentions of people. So I believe at some point all this will be received the just resolution it deserves. But I don't know how long that will be. Eventually, people will get it right, but how many will suffer until then? I don't know. Well, this has been the Happy Warrior Podcast with your ever-lovable host, Happy Warrior Pete Pischke. And until next time, my friends, take care and good night, America.
Thank you for listening. The Happy Warrior Podcast, hosted by Peter Von Pischke, produced by Robert Mailing, a production of the Sioux Empire Podcast Network. Learn more at happy-warrior.net.
At the SiouxEmpire.com.